Michelle Pfeiffer is in the middle of a career resurgence and stars in not one but two upcoming TV series, and she credits her husband, David E. Kelley, for supporting her. Michelle told Entertainment Tonight, "I think we both know that I've put in my time, and now it is my time."
Some love stories are written on the page. Some are written between the lines, in the silences, in the things two people spend 30 years refusing to say. And after more than 3 decades, one half of Hollywood's most whispered about affair has finally spoken. The other half still hasn't said a word. This is the story of what John Malkovich just admitted about Michelle Pfeiffer, and why her silence might be the loudest part of the whole thing. In 1988, a film called Dangerous Liaisons arrived in theaters and immediately unsettled audiences in the best possible way. Adapted from an 18th-century French novel about manipulation, seduction, and the games powerful people play with weaker hearts, the movie starred Glenn Close, John Malkovich, and Michelle Pfeiffer, and it earned 7 Academy Award nominations for its trouble. Director Stephen Frears built something genuinely dangerous out of that story, and at the center of it was a scorching, slow-burn dynamic between Malkovich's calculating seducer, the Vicomte de Valmorne, and Pfeiffer's virtuous, doomed Madame de Tourvel. On screen, Valmorne sets out to destroy Tourvel's marriage for sport, only to fall for her in the process. It's the kind of role that asks two actors to manufacture months of aching, forbidden intimacy. And sometimes, when the cameras finally stop rolling, the manufactured version doesn't fully switch off. At the time, both actors were, by outward appearances, settled. Michelle Pfeiffer had married television writer and producer Peter Horton back in 1981, after the two met in an acting class in Los Angeles. They had worked together more than once. Horton directed her in a television special, and the pair appeared together in a 1987 comedy, and Pfeiffer has said in later interviews that Horton played a real role in helping her get free of a controlling, cult-like group that had been taking advantage of her early in her career. By most accounts, theirs looked like one of the more grounded marriages in Hollywood. John Malkovich, for his part, had been married since 1982 to actress Glenn Headley, a fellow member of Chicago's Steppenwolf Theatre Company, the same storied ensemble that produced actors like Gary Sinise and Joan Allen. Malkovich and Headley's relationship wasn't just a marriage, it was rooted in a shared artistic history that went back years, forged in rehearsal rooms long before either of them was famous. And then came the shoot. Filming took the cast overseas, into the kind of prolonged, isolated production schedule that tends to blur the line between the people actors are pretending to be and the people they actually are. Something happened between Pfeiffer and Malkovich during those months, not rumor, not speculation, but something that would eventually be confirmed on the record, just not by either of them. 4 years, the closest thing to confirmation came from someone else entirely, their own director. In a profile published years later, Stephen Frears stated plainly that Malkovich's marriage was falling apart during filming, and that during the production, he was involved with Pfeiffer. Frears even noted the strange irony of it, a film literally about betrayal and unraveling relationships, mirrored by an unraveling happening just off camera. It was, as directors go, about as close to an on-the-record confirmation as the public would get for a very long time. The math, meanwhile, did plenty of talking on its own. Both marriages collapsed in 1988, the same year Dangerous Liaisons hit theaters. Pfeiffer and Horton separated and divorced quietly, without public animosity. Pfeiffer has since described the split as amicable, even joking that Horton helped her pack her car on the way out. Malkovich and Headley's marriage ended around the same time, closing not just a romantic chapter but an entire shared creative world the two of them had built together since their Steppenwolf days. 2 marriages, 1 film set, 1 narrow window of time. The tabloids noticed immediately, and the whispers took hold and never really let go, drifting through Hollywood for over 30 years as one of those stories that everyone seemed to half know but no one could fully confirm. Headley went on to build a respected career of her own, memorable for roles in comedies like Dirty Rotten Scoundrels, before her death in 2017. Horton continued working steadily in television. And Malkovich and Pfeiffer, the two people who actually lived the story everyone was speculating about, said absolutely nothing publicly for decades. Not confirmation. Not denial. Just silence, the kind of silence that, in the gossip economy of Hollywood, tends to get treated as its own kind of answer, whether that's fair or not, which is what makes what happened recently so notable. In September of 2025, Malkovich sat down for a conversation on the Fashion Neurosis podcast, hosted by Bella Freud, and did something he had spent nearly 4 decades carefully avoiding. He actually talked about it. Not in the sensational, tell-all way tabloids might have wanted, but in his own precise, unhurried, faintly philosophical way, which, if you know anything about Malkovich, is exactly how you'd expect him to do it. He acknowledged up front that this wasn't a subject he'd ever really discussed publicly, and he meant it. For most of his career, Malkovich has kept his private life firmly off the record, letting the work do the talking instead. But roughly 25 minutes into that interview, he opened the door anyway. He described the emotional mechanics of his profession in a way that felt less like a confession and more like an explanation of how these things happen in the first place. Acting, he said, is a job that requires you to build emotional bonds with people very quickly. That's simply part of the work. Only rarely, he noted, do those bonds extend past the work itself. It's a strikingly clinical way to describe falling for a co-star, and that clinical distance is very much the point. Malkovich has never been a man who performs his emotions for an audience off-camera the way he does on it. Then he turned to Pfeiffer specifically, and his tone shifted from analytical to something warmer. He called her someone he valued enormously as a colleague, someone who was, in his words, great fun to work with and remarkably fair. He didn't linger on romance. He lingered on respect, on what she was like as a scene partner, as a collaborator, as someone he trusted in the work itself. And then came the line that's been quoted everywhere since, the one that finally cracked open 30-plus years of silence. He said that when a professional relationship becomes something more than collegial, more than a friendship, even a profound one, you end up, in his experience, losing a great colleague. He even added, almost self-deprecatingly, that he'd learned over the course of his life that a great colleague is rarer than almost anything else, and that whatever went wrong between them was, in his estimation, more his fault than hers. Read that carefully, because it matters what he didn't say. He never used the word affair. He never offered a single tabloid-ready detail. He didn't deny it happened, either, and that absence of denial, from a man who has spent decades not talking about this at all, functions as close to an admission as the public is ever likely to get from him. To make his point land, he compared his working relationship with Pfeiffer to one of his other longtime collaborators, an actress he's worked with for over 3 decades without incident, precisely because, in his own words, there was a line the two of them never crossed. The implication sat right there in plain sight. With Pfeiffer, that line didn't hold. And what he seems to regret most, by his own account, isn't the romance itself. It's what the romance cost him afterward, the professional partnership, the version of their creative relationship that might have continued for decades if things had stayed collegial. So where, in all of this, does that leave Michelle Pfeiffer? Exactly where she's always been, silent. Despite Malkovich's rare and widely reported comments, Pfeiffer has not addressed the affair. Not in an interview, not in a statement, not in so much as a passing remark. While outlets covering Malkovich's podcast appearance were quick to note his admission, virtually every one of them included some version of the same caveat, that Pfeiffer herself has never publicly commented on the relationship at all. That silence isn't new, and there's no indication it's about to break. If anything, her public energy over the last 3 decades has flowed in the opposite direction, toward talking, warmly and often, about her second marriage. Pfeiffer met television producer David E. Kelley, the mind behind a string of major hits, and the two married in 1993. More than 30 years later, they are still together, and Pfeiffer has spoken candidly in interviews about how protective she's been of that relationship and the family they built, including their 2 children. She's even said, on more than one occasion, that she made a personal rule never to work professionally with her own husband, precisely so their marriage wouldn't become entangled with the pressures of the job. It's hard not to notice the echo there. Whether or not it was conscious, a woman who lived through what happened on the set of Dangerous Liaisons drawing a firm boundary between love and collaboration afterward feels like its own kind of quiet statement, even if she's never once confirmed why, professionally, both actors kept building. Pfeiffer's career, if anything, accelerated in the years right after Dangerous Liaisons. She earned a Golden Globe and an Oscar nomination for The Fabulous Baker Boys, delivered one of the most iconic images of 90s cinema in that film's piano scene, and followed it with Frankie and Johnny and a legendary turn as Catwoman in Batman Returns. In more recent years, she stepped into the Marvel Cinematic Universe through the Ant-Man films, proof that 4 decades in, she's still very much in demand. Malkovich, meanwhile, took his career somewhere stranger and, in its own way, more singular, from an Oscar nomination for In the Line of Fire to the surreal self-aware comedy of Being John Malkovich, a film literally built around the odd experience of being him, and onward into an increasingly international body of theater and film work. He's now been in a long-term relationship with Nicoletta Peyran for years, with whom he has 2 children, and by his own account has built a life in Europe that sits well outside the machinery that once consumed so much of his attention, which brings us back to the real question at the heart of this story, not whether something happened between Pfeiffer and Malkovich on that film set in 1988, because by now that part isn't seriously in dispute. Their own director said as much on the record over 2 decades ago, and Malkovich's own words fill in nearly everything else. The real question is why one of them finally decided to talk about it, and why the other has never once been tempted to. Maybe it's simply personality. Malkovich has always spoken in these careful, philosophical riddles, comfortable examining his own choices out loud as long as he can frame them as lessons rather than confessions. Maybe Pfeiffer, who has spent her entire career cultivating a public image built on privacy and restraint, sees no version of addressing this that serves her, 3 decades and a second, thriving marriage later. Or maybe it's simpler than either of those theories. Maybe some chapters are just easier to close when only one person insists on reopening them. What's clear is that this was never really a story about scandal for its own sake. It's a story about what happens when 2 people are asked, professionally, to fall in love night after night, and the emotional muscle memory that builds doesn't always stay confined to the set. It's a story about the different ways people carry the aftermath of a choice like that, one turning it into a quiet, decades later reflection about professional loss, the other choosing, consistently and without apparent regret, to say nothing at all. And it's a story about how thoroughly both of them managed to move forward anyway, building entirely new lives, new families, and decades of acclaimed work on the other side of a scandal that, at the time, must have felt like it could define them forever. 32 years after the cameras stopped rolling on Dangerous Liaisons, one half of that story has finally spoken, in his own careful, characteristically indirect way. The other half remains exactly where she's always been, silent, private, and by every indication, perfectly at peace with staying that way. What do you make of it? Does Malkovich's admission change how you see the story, or does Pfeiffer's continued silence tell you everything you actually need to know? Let us know in the comments, and if you want more of these deep dives into the stories Hollywood tried to keep quiet, subscribe and turn on notifications. There's plenty more where this came from.